Here is 3 Oysters, Hwangto, and orange ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
Although this is an orange, it can be a very yellow from the wrong pen or on the wrong paper. Now there's very noticeable tone variation by pen from hard to read to a beautiful orange. It does shade, but it isn't the standout feature of this ink. To me, it can be that beautiful tone. Now on non-fountain pen friendly paper, it kind of performs a little bit better as it can be darker and more readable. This is beautiful in the right pen, and that might be just too much work to use for an ink. Having to guard what pen you put this ink into, it's like 1 out of 3 good to me here. That could be a problem, though I know I usually make pen recommendations. Hopefully, normally, even if you chose a different pen, you don't get a horrible experience, but you run that risk with this ink. It's just a rough one for that. Though it's beautiful as its tone, it can be rough with the wrong pen.
All of the writing samples are done with a Retro 51 P51 with a fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub.
The pen for today is a Visconti Medici.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the extra fine nib, we get a nice mid-tone for what this can put down. Now it doesn't feather, it doesn't spread. The thing we're getting here is a lot of yellow shading into orange. So yes, it does shade. Now the shading that's happening isn't huge and stand out. This is kind of a light orange, yellow-ish sort of tone that we're getting. But it is easy to read on the page, which would make it a great second ink to be using. The shading, it's good. If you cannot say it's not there, look at cannot on the second line, where the C and the T are both darker than the ano in the middle. Looking at the medium nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the extra fine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, though that's not what really stands out here. What stands out is this beautiful orange tone that we're getting on the page. Very easy to read, really stand out, much nicer than we had with the extra fine for sure. Looking at the stub nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, lighter than it was with the extra fine. It is yellow and hard to read as a bunch of writing. Now, it doesn't feather and it doesn't spread. It does shade, and it shades fairly well when it's doing it. I can see a whole page of this really being a problem to read, though using it to add a word here or there in notes might not be a problem and might draw your attention a little better to the added note that you put down. Looking at the back of the page, with no surprises, there's no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like, this is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelikan M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There's approximately 6 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade about as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Now, it's the same type of yellowish kind of orange. It's an orange with a very heavy yellow lean. It is much easier to read here than it was on the Clairfontaine, which makes it a much better combination. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade very well. Take a look at waistcoat on the second line, where the W is light, the A darkens up a little bit. The IST are a nice mid-tone. The CO lighten up a little bit. The A starts to get darker and the T darker still. Looking at the stub nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium. Same tone as the Clairefontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, doesn't shade. Still hard to read on the page. Still an abomination from this pen on this paper. It's bad. It's not the worst that I've seen, but this would be really disappointing to have to look back. At least you can read it. Looking at the back of the page, no surprises as there's no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairefontaine, definitely showing much more of an orange tone than it did with that Clairefontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It does shade better than it did on the Clairefontaine. The tone here looks absolutely it's great. It's so much better. It does show that the ink is a little bit more translucent as it's affected by the tone of the paper underneath, and in this case is really working in its favor. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine. It does not feather, does not spread. Those little dots with circles, those are from the bleed spots that were tiny from the previous ink. Kind of ignore that. It'll happen again with the broad. It's not affecting what we're seeing here. The shading is pretty good in my opinion. Look at opinion on the first line, where the OPI are darker than the NI, which lighten up a little bit. The on at the end does start to get a little bit darker. Very easy to read on this page. Very nice. It's just absolutely beautiful when it's coming out with this tone. Looking at the stub nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine, lighter than it was with the extra fine. Really, I'm sorry, but it doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade. It's just unfortunate to be looking at on the page. I do wish it was a little bit darker. Again, I can read what's there though, but I could see it being a real problem if I had a whole page that I had to go through. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting, making it easy to continue your notes back here.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairefontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade just as well as it did on the Clairefontaine. However, we look at this because of that quad rule, which it does not really stand out against. It really fades into the background where you see the quad with the suggestion of writing behind it. Very unfortunate for what's happening. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade just as well as it did on the Clairefontaine, meaning it's not the standout quality that you're really jumping at here. As far as what it's doing with the quad rule, even though it's just as dark, it's something about it really makes it on the same level as the quad rule, so you see them both at the same time, meaning this for me is not a good ink for these quad rule papers, at least thus far. Looking at the stub nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade as well as it did on the Clairefontaine. It is still a yellow coming out of this pen, which is very unfortunate and makes it hard to see as a whole page of writing. When I look at all of this, it becomes a bit mushy on the eyes. Again, I think this would still be a good secondary color, just not with the quad rule. Avoid that. Looking at the back of the page, it would be a joke if it did bleed or ghost, so thankfully it didn't, and this is not funny.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Diamine Orange.
Here is Kaweco Sunrise Orange.
Here is Mont Blanc Ink of Joy. Here is Robert Oster Orange.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread. It does have shading, though less than it did on the Clairfontaine. It is on quad rule, which means it blends into the background as if the quad was put down over top of it, making it very hard to really distinguish your writing from the pattern of the printing on the page. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, lighter, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread. Yes, it does shade. No, it does not stand out against this quad rule. Once again, showing don't use this ink on quad rule paper or you will visually lose it as it drowns with all those lines. Looking at the stub nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, lighter than it was with the extra fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. All not being a very good thing. Now, it doesn't feather, it doesn't spread. Yes, it does shade, but no, it is really unnecessarily light. Look at necessary on the second line. Boy, is that hard to read, and that's kind of what we're looking at here, hard to read. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting, so at least you could continue your notes on the back, though I'd be surprised if it had any problems.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Noodler's Liberty's Elysium. Here is Noodler's Burma Road Brown. Here is Diamine Woodland Green.
Here is Robert Oster Tolerance. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does feather, it does spread. In this case, the feathering's really under control and not a problem. The spread, I think, is helping it stand out from this paper much more, meaning this is a very good ink to use on this paper because it stands out well. It is easy to read. It makes this a win on this paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Yes, it feathers and yes, it spreads. The feathering is easily under control. It might be there and horrible, but it would be hard to see. It would probably be yellowish. Now, as far as the spread, I think the spread, the way it helped with the extra fine, it's also helping with this medium. So good news for those that are using copy paper a lot. This could be a very distinctive ink for you to use. Looking at the stub nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, has moments of shading. Now, I'm saying doesn't feather and doesn't spread because it's so light it would really be hard to tell. However, I do find it easier to read on this paper than it was with the other papers. So it still gets to be a winner here. Even as light as it is, it stands out well enough that a whole page wouldn't be the most comfortable, but wouldn't be as bad as some of the others. Looking at the back of the page, really only the medium. I think you could write back here. If you were using this ink on both sides, I think you have a winner. Yes, we can see spots where the ink gets very deep into the paper, but I don't think it's going to disrupt what you actually see on both sides. So you can write on the back of this page and nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The extra fine gives the mid-tone and does shade some. Now, the medium is the darkest tone and also shades a little. The stub is the lightest, often yellow, and has the least amount of shading. Now, the pen you're seeing now is a wet, stubbish, broad nib and looks beautiful. So this shows me that the wetter pens write darker and shade better than any in the writing sample. So I go for a gusher of a wet pen regardless of its nib size, and I absolutely avoid a dry pen because the yellow left behind is almost unreadable.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.